Avanzamos en la era de la transformación digital, uniendo territorios y redescubriendo los rostros de nuestro país. Porque al estar conectados no diremos nada, pero habrá señales, conectividad y tecnología para cambiar la vida.
Colombia, potencia de la vida.
Bueno, buenas tardes a todos, bienvenidos. Les informo que en 2 minutos estaremos dando inicio al evento, entonces esperamos que las personas que se están aproximando se terminen de registrar porque ya estamos a punto de comenzar.
A Bogotá región la define su gente. Gente innovadora, trabajadora, madrugadora, echada pa'lante. Una ciudad región de emprendedores, de tenderas, de comerciantes. Una ciudad región con un sueño. Un sueño que hace 145 años fundó la Cámara de Comercio de Bogotá. Desde entonces, hemos trabajado por todas las empresas, especialmente las pequeñas. Las hemos ayudado a nacer, a crecer y a expandirse. Y sobre todo, las hemos acompañado. Y algo más, han sido 145 años de trabajar por Bogotá y la región. Una Bogotá región para los negocios, la cultura, las ideas y la innovación. Y lo más importante, una Bogotá región de oportunidades. Más equitativa, más incluyente, más sostenible y más próspera. Mucho más próspera. Son 145 años de historias que no se detienen. 145 años de historias que van hacia adelante.
En WOM seguimos trabajando para que Colombia nos diga sí, sí y 1000 veces sí. Con nuestras más de 5.000 antenas ya llegamos a más de 725 municipios, cubriendo a más de 46 millones de colombianos, demostrando que en WOM no paramos de mejorar por el país. Queremos que los colombianos siempre reciban más. Por eso aumentamos las gigas en todos nuestros planes postpago y logramos reducir sus precios hasta en un 52%. Además, llegamos a más lugares en Colombia con nuestras más de 475 tiendas y kioscos que hoy nos han convertido en el segundo operador con mayor presencia alrededor del país. Estamos seguros de que la transformación sí es posible. Por eso logramos que 648
buenas tardes para todos. Les damos la bienvenida a Colombia 4.0 edición IA. Quienes nos acompañan de manera presencial, les damos un cordial saludo y también a quienes se encuentran de manera remota. También queremos invitarlos a quienes nos acompañan de manera virtual a que sigan nuestra transmisión por vía streaming en la página www.col40.co. En esta edición, los mejores speakers del sector de las TIC y de la industria digital están en un solo lugar y, sobre todo, de manera gratuita. Por eso, este evento es organizado por el Ministerio de Tecnologías de la Información y las Comunicaciones. Dan a conocer la experiencia de personas que lograron que sus ideas del mundo digital se convirtieran en una realidad que transforman su vida y su entorno. Así que, bienvenidos a la era de la inteligencia artificial. A continuación, presentamos la conferencia How to Build the Games Industry You Want. Esta conferencia es organizada por Colombia 4.0 y nuestro invitado es Co-CEO, Managing Director, Christian Roberts. Él es el socio director de Nordic City, una importante consultora internacional que dirige la práctica global de Nordicity en videojuegos, medios digitales y tecnologías emergentes. Su experiencia en la economía y la estructura de estas industrias le ha llevado a desarrollar, mejorar y evaluar intervenciones públicas en todo el mundo. Recientemente ha trabajado en Nueva Zelanda como un estímulo de la inversión, en Australia en la comprensión de nuevos impuestos, en Bahrein en estrategias de juegos y en Alemania en comparación de incentivos. Así que démosle una bienvenida a nuestro speaker, Christian.
All right. Can you hear me? Good. Yes, good. All right. We'll need that thing, that there, so they can see these things. Get my slides up on the screen. Is that a thing we can do? Hey, victory! Look at us. All right. Thank you for your patience in getting started. Little technical difficulties, and I appear to have some feedback. Look at that. All right. So, how to build the games industry you want? Can you still hear me? By the way. Yeah, that's what I thought. Hopefully that will be easier in a minute. All right, but what I'm here to talk about are the three things. Good news is that if you can read English, that most of this stuff is on the screen. So I'm here to talk about really three things. One, why should anybody, particularly policy people, care about the games industry, which is the precondition to building a games industry somewhere, is people have to give a shit about it. Oh, also, I'm sorry if I swear a few times. I do that. Second is what are the types of supports and incentives that are used by around the world to help grow games industries? And the third thing is how do those things actually work? Because that's seemingly kind of important when you're building public policy or trying to support the growth of the games industry. So before we do that, here's me in fun avatar form. So as the introduction mentioned, I run a consulting firm based in Canada that I spend a lot of time talking to governments around the planet about the economic impacts of the creative industries like games and how they can get them. I've been doing this since about 2007, which super doesn't make me feel old, I promise. And so I do things like I make reports that have industry profiles and talk about economic impact. I develop policies, I evaluate those policies for governments, and then I help for organizations like COVA here in Colombia advocate for change. So, better? There we go, less feedback, look at me. All right, so these are a few of the little pins around the world of places that we've done this work. Momentarily waiting for no feedback. Going this way, not going this way. Keep going, all right. Okay, so a few examples of things we've done. We've done these sorts of reports for places like in the UK or Germany or in Canada, where I'm from, helped folks actually implement and develop economic policy for places like New Zealand, Australia, Canada, the UK, Switzerland, a bunch of other places. But that's enough about me. It's not why you're here. So really, the big reason why people give a crap about games is the economic potential of this industry. When last anybody counted, it accounted for about 184 billion US dollars a year. Okay, that's a big number, but mostly when I say that number, it's a big number. But to put that into some context, if you add up all of the money that's made in film and television, and all the ads that are on film and television, all the Netflix subscriptions, all of that, then you take all of recorded music, all the Spotify accounts in the world, you add them all together, you don't get to that number. So games is bigger than those really well supported, really well documented creative industries put together. In Latin America, you can see that in this slide from Newzoo that it accounted for about 4% of the global total, but it is one of the fastest growing regions, so there's an opportunity to get people to care. But okay, great. A lot of people spend a lot of money on games, but how does that actually help a country? Really does that in two important ways. We call export revenue, which is money you make outside of your home jurisdiction, and foreign direct investment, so people actually putting money in either directly into game companies or putting new game companies into a location. Both of those yield to more full-time jobs, they lead to more profits, but ultimately what governments care about is that creates more tax revenue, more fiscal revenue for a company, sorry, for a country. It also employs people. Now, it employs people in a very different way than some of the other creative industries do. In general, we're talking about full-time jobs in permanent establishments, which means that they stay there beyond when the game is done. You build a second game where you built the first game. They create a lot of transferable skills. And I'll get why that's important in a second, but the governments are beginning to understand that creating game skills also means that you're creating healthcare skills and automotive skills and some other stuff. These jobs are also those that are particularly appealing to younger people. So in places that have lots of large young populations, and we're asking ourselves questions about how do we employ all these people, games presents that opportunity. And then, of course, it presents a unique combination of art, technology, and business, which is not something that really you can say about many other industries. So you can pull from a variety of different places to create a games industry. A good example of this employment is where I'm from, which is probably why I'm here talking about this. I live in a country of about 40 million people. It employs about 30,000 people every year on a full-time basis just to make games. I might argue that we don't employ the people in the right way, but that's a different story for later in this presentation. So, beyond economics, there is another role for games, and this is something that, as I sort of started to talk about earlier, that people who are thinking about supporting the games industry or thinking about growing a games ecosystem are starting to understand, is that games are kind of the gateway drug to the future of a lot of different industries. So we heard a lot this morning, a lot today about the future of a lot of different industries, but games provide the skills that allow you to build educational platforms for engaging young students, or motion tracking gameplay that help physiotherapy for older people. Even sort of well-established titles like Minecraft can be used to actually teach kids how to code without them knowing that they're learning how to code. They just know the basics of if, then, else logic. Can also help in sort of straight up medical uses, like cognitive behavioral therapy, which actually helps have people play games in order to change how their brain actually works. And then, of course, you have this sort of notion of Unity, where you can talk about the Unreal Engine as well as being a sort of foundational skill that can be applied to way more industries than I started to touch upon. So that's, in general, why people start to care, right? Like, oh yeah, right, we can employ a bunch of people, we can get money from the rest of the world and bring it to wherever we are. So that's the starting point. So yes, we've gotten through the door. We've said, we've knocked on the door of the minister. They've opened it up and they said, cool, how do we do that? The common ways of supporting a game industry are these here, right? We talk about training programs. This is usually the kind of easiest one. We're like, oh, we will just train people how to make games. Okay. There's other things like incubators or accelerators, which provide funding to startups, help those things, help startup companies grow. Sometimes jurisdictions or places decide to put money directly in companies. We call these direct funding programs. And then sometimes you have financial incentives like tax rebates or just expenditure rebates. These are kind of there's common ways. I'm sure there's others that somebody could say, what about this other way that we support the games industry, like trade missions or whatever. But these are kind of the ways that really support the creation of an industry in a place. Now, independently, they're good, but they really work when they're put together. So one way I like to think of this is sort of think about it as a developer's journey, as the career path of one person working through their life. Maybe start in a training program. They played games as a kid. They're like, you know what? I'm going to go to school and I'm going to learn how to make games. So they do, and that creates what's called junior talent. Then they maybe go to an incubator. And they say, cool, well, I have an idea and I want to sort of see if there's a business here. Is there a game here? And cool, so they exit the incubator and they have a proto company. They have something that's ready to turn into a company. Then maybe they have access to a funding program. That funding program says, cool, I get to take that from an idea, from a proto company, to something that somebody might actually want to put money into, or an investable game, or an exportable game. Then they do well, they're cool, I made a game, yay, I want to make more games. So then they can be supported by one of those financial incentives, by a rebate program, which allows them to take more risks when they develop their next game. So these things work best in this continuum. And in fact, there's lots of words on this slide and even some pictures, but the most important thing on this slide is the arrow. And when there are gaps in this system, when there's things, when you have training programs, but there's nowhere for them to go, then they leave. When you have incubators and there's nothing for them to do after they have their great idea, they leave, they go to a different industry. So thinking about this as a continuum, as a journey, is probably the best way to look at it. But I put a boxer in the last two because those are the ones I'm going to keep talking about. I could do a whole course on this. I could teach this in business school or something, but we're going to talk about these last two bits for the rest of my talk. So starting with direct funding, I'm sort of like, how does it work? What is it all about? So as it's pretty obvious, right? Direct funding is when governments take a bunch of money and put it into companies. And these companies typically submit an application to a program, and there's usually a jury, and those juries decide which programs are funded on whatever merits. Sometimes these are cultural merits. Sometimes these are innovation merits. Is a program in Canada that likes to think about itself as innovative, and no one really understands what innovative means. And so then companies take that money and they use it to develop some or part or all of a piece of intellectual property or a game. The reason I say it that way is because quite often these programs are divided into prototype funds and then maybe production funds. They have that distinction. Then, if they've made a prototype, then they can take that money and ideally publish them game themselves, which means take their own game to the market, or it can be they take that prototype or minimum viable product here and shop it to publishers to get investment. Ultimately, that means that they can generate that intellectual property, goes out onto the world, creates export revenue. That export revenue comes back to the home jurisdiction. That's how this one works. The other one is I call it rebate programs. You might also hear them called tax credits. I could get into a whole diversion as to different types of tax credits, but for those who understand what they are, we're talking about refundable tax credits or just really refunds. So games are a really labor-intensive thing to do, right? The number one thing any game company spends their money on is people. And so these are incentives that help to mitigate the cost of those people. And sometimes they go beyond people. Some of the more effective credits in the world, they start to offset other important costs, software development kits, those hosting fees, those types of things. But really, these are the point of these programs, other than to try to be competitive with the other versions of these programs in the world, is to try to make it less risky to run a games company. So in general, how they work is this kind of, if they're constructed well, they have this kind of feedback loop where a jurisdiction says, okay, I'm going to give you a certain amount back from the money you spend, which means, of course, you have to have the money in the first place to spend it. Then you're going to take that money and take more risks, hire more people, create more games than you otherwise would. That money is then helps to build a local ecosystem. As the local ecosystem builds, it creates a larger workforce, and then therefore more taxation, which allows them the program to continue. And if properly constructed, this kind of works in a sort of virtuous cycle, where the government maybe breaks even or spends a little bit of money on the program, but it's increasing its tax base, or increasing the amount it can generate in taxes as it continues to run these programs. Right. So now you've all been to business school. How did that feel? Good? Business school? I now gift you all an MBA. All right, but not that you really wanted one. But now that you have your MBA, I'm going to get into a little bit more detail. You don't have to remember all the things on this slide. This is a good one to take a picture of, though. So how is, more practically, how does this work? So it works that they're generally administered through arm's length entities, like government agencies that whose job it is to run these programs and are slightly insulated from the whims of politics. And they each have their kind of pros and cons. So a direct funding program, these things putting money into companies, can be more flexible, right? Because you can decide this year I want to put my money into, only games that have the letter E in them. you could do that if you wanted to. But they also rely on juries, so which means that you have to apply every year. And you can apply, I know a couple of programs where I know companies that have applied for the same game 3 years in a row, no differences, rejected, rejected, accepted. Why? It doesn't make any sense. And at times, it is also true that some of these direct programs become investors. So they take equity positions in the games that they invest in. So the rebate programs, on the other hand, are longer-term investments. They're often the reason they're called tax credits is that they're often stuck in the tax code of a jurisdiction, which means that you have to pass a law to get rid of them. So it's actually really hard to get rid of, and also really hard to change. They're also relatively automatic. If you meet the criteria, which can be quite complicated, but if you meet the criteria, you get your money. Figuring out how those criteria work often takes a lot of time and takes a lot of little detail work, but they're pretty automatic. And so what that means for games companies is that they can put them into their financial plans and say, I will get money from this expenditure, and so I can bank on it, and I can then hire more people because I know I'm going to get a chunk of that change back. And the last point here is probably the most critical point that I'm going to make, is that all of these programs are most effectively delivered, and perhaps only effectively delivered, when they're done so by actual human beings who understand how the games industry works. Maybe an AI, right? Like maybe we could train an AI over a long period of time, but that would be a really large data set, and it would take a long time to train them, and we'd have to just have human beings training the AI anyway, so why not just get the human being to do it in the first place? But it's also important that whatever organization that does this has a clear mandate to do it, right? So how to build the games industry you want is that the organization or the entity that is supporting the games industry has to actually want to do it and have a clear mandate to do it. And we find in some places where it's somebody, let's say they're administering film or TV or music or something, and somebody comes along and says, Psst, hey, you want to do games too? And they're like, fine, I guess. So what happens is that they get a direct funding program that sits in the corner that nobody can access. Or they get a tax credit that doesn't really work because it doesn't have, those people have no idea how games work. And why would they? That hasn't been their job. So that is, and so when you look at a key rebate programs, there's a lot of different criteria. There's these things called, they have a percentage base that, it's 30% of all expenditures. Those, of course, apply only to certain types of expenditures. So there's a lot of detail work. I won't read through this giant list of criteria. The point of it only is to say that there's a lot of detail work when you think about these types of programs. So this is where those programs are in the world. You have what can we see about where they are located? So they're located in those jurisdictions in the developed world, right? So the developed world, and you see that Canada and Western Europe particularly are leaders in this space, for better or worse. And that's where my offices are. So yeah, that's why I do this talk, because I spend a long time learning about these things. They're all different in some ways, and I'm sure if you looked hard enough, you could find a country that you would say, yeah, like, isn't there a funding program in that country? And you're probably right. I don't think I've done all of the homework that I could do here. But the other thing is that I have excluded programs that theoretically have games in them, but don't actually work for games. So, like maybe one that you might be familiar with that I am currently standing in. So that doesn't mean it can't work, it just means they haven't yet worked. The other thing so then the natural question here is this only really an opportunity for the developed world? And I quite vocally will say no, this is something that the developed world has been fighting itself over for a long time, but developing economies have an opportunity to not only join this conversation, but to lead this conversation, to leapfrog a lot of these policies, because we'll go back. Oops. Because we made a lot of mistakes. We made a lot of things. We photocopied a lot of tax credits from and incentive programs from film, and TV, and we've spent the last 20 years figuring out how to undo that mistake. That is not something that the rest of the world needs to follow. All right, so let's say we have these programs. Great, we have direct funding programs, we have rebates, but what do they actually do? Like, why would we do them? So direct funding programs, again, these are about kickstarting local projects and local companies. This is money that goes into companies and allows them to build the thing that they may eventually export to the world. It allows them to tell their stories that come from where they are in the world to the rest of the planet. Rebate programs, on the other hand, they incentivize employment, hiring more people, creating greater, and competing with other nearby jurisdictions that might have similar kinds of programs and can afford to pay more for their talent. They result in more employment and more risk-taking. They also are kind of often a precondition for multinational companies to set up shop in a local place. So when Ubisoft or EA or somebody comes around, the first thing they ask, one of the first things they ask is, cool, well, do you have a tax credit? And if so, how big is it? Is it the same big? Can we all have a tax credit measuring contest, please? But they're most suited to other than attracting those multinationals, they're suited to supporting established companies, because these are companies that first need to have the money to spend in order to get it back later. So not as good for developing a developing ecosystem. And this is ultimately the point of what I want to talk about today, is thinking about what you're actually. I gave you all kinds of options. I'll give you an MBA and how to support a games industry. But the point, I'm trying to find a sweet spot here I gotta stand right here. Okay, I don't move. I don't even move my head. I'm gonna look this way. Is that you have to build a games industry that actually makes sense for you. It's not about copying what's done in other creative industries. It's not about copying what was done in some other jurisdiction, even though it might have been perfectly successful in that jurisdiction. Sure, use them as resources and inspiration. Call them, see how it went, see how it went, how it was to implement them. But to build the industry you want, you have to answer 3 questions. Why do you want a games industry? What of those things that I talked about in the beginning are the driving reasons behind driving the industry? Is it about building export revenue? Is it about employing people? Is it both? Is it about telling your stories to the world? These are all good reasons, but that's a reason to build a games industry. What does your game industry actually look like? Is it a bunch of big companies that need support because they need to compete for talent with people around the world? Are they a bunch of small companies that don't yet have the money or resources to hire a bunch of people? I'll wait. All right. And is it ready for those? And as a consequence, is your jurisdiction ready for those rebate incentives? And then perhaps most importantly, which actual people have the mandate, the expertise, so mandate, which means it's their job to support the games industry, the expertise, which means they know something about the games industry, and perhaps most importantly, the actual time and resources to do it. And so answer those 3 questions, probably in that order, and you can pick from the rest of my slides as to what kind of games industry you want to create. All right, now, hopefully, we can go to questions or commentaries or whatever you want. I have a translatey device over somewhere if somebody wants, so you can ask questions in whatever language. My translating device is on its way. So, Spanish language questions in 1 second, please. Thank you.
Okay, so comparing direct investment versus rebate, you mentioned that one is for local success stories, and the other one is for attracting foreign companies, right? I understand that both are good, and I also understand that competition to make the local industry stronger is better, but this might be one of those it depends questions, but what would you recommend for the specific ecosystem of Colombia, right? And just a quick context for that. Usually we have the issue that external companies come, right, pay high salaries, which is great, right? But then most of the knowledge and the taxes and all that go to outside, right?
Yeah.
But on the other hand, I mean, I understand, like, I am the owner of a company, I understand. I have to become competitive, right, for the talent too. So what would you recommend? It's like a kind of a difficult balance.
It's a good question and deserves a bigger answer than I can give you right now. But the answer is probably both. Because the thing that Colombia has is both of those two things, right? You have companies like yourself who need to compete internationally. And that's another important point, as I maybe didn't bolt enough of that sentence. But if I go back here, it's suited to attracting major multinationals and supporting more established studios. So the second part of that sentence is also super important. And so I think Colombia is in a position where it has some companies that can be supported that need to compete internationally for that talent. It also has a lot of people who have great ideas and who should, who could get that seed capital that allows them to create that intellectual property to start commercializing it around the world. But ultimately, what I would always argue is for the arrow on that slide, right? Is to have an ability to have a continuum from, I have an idea for a game as a student or as a kid, and I could see myself working through the schools, so through an incubator or support or some mentoring program or whatever, to then I have some support to build that minimum viable product or and build my company around it. So yeah, I would love to continue to answer that question. Oh, one more.
Buenas tardes. Según su experiencia en el mundo, con respecto a los impuestos que pagan las compañías de juegos, ¿qué experiencia o cómo se focalizaría ese tipo de impuestos en los países donde hay industrias que no son solamente de juegos, pero que utilizan el juego como una herramienta para hacer un proyecto? Entonces, digamos que lo que me gustaría saber es si en las legislaciones de otros países, si en la jurisprudencia y en las leyes de impuestos de otros países hay híbridos donde se manejan el concepto no solamente impuesto porque es una empresa de juegos, sino un impuesto de otra forma, pero que utiliza juegos. No sé si me hice entender.
So yes, you did make yourself clear. The answer is yes, that does happen in some places. And usually the way that they do that is the two words serious games. And so that's usually the way that jurisdictions say, okay, well, we're going to allow serious games. And then what the downside of that is then they spend the next 5 years figuring out what they mean. Because it's quite a big nebulous concept, and there are limits, right? So it's really easy to find something that isn't applicable. Like if I say I want to make an AR experience that uses a game engine but has no interactive components, that's probably easily not a game. But what if it has how many interactive components does it need before it becomes a serious game? So again, somebody has to make that decision. Some actual person needs to make that decision to say, this is a game and this isn't a game. And having the context, the knowledge to do so is really important. Turns out that you can't do everything on a spreadsheet. Sometimes you need actual people to figure this out for you. So, but to answer your first question, it does absolutely exist, and that's how they do it. Any other questions?
Any other question?
All right. Well, I'll be around if you want to ask me questions that aren't on a stage somewhere. But otherwise, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Christian, for the conference. Muchas gracias a Christian por su intervención acerca de los videojuegos y de qué manera estos contribuyen a la industria. Así que muchas gracias también a todos por sus preguntas y de igual manera, Christian se encuentra disponible si tienen otras inquietudes. Entonces, a continuación, vamos a recibir a Sara Giraldo, quien desarrollará la conferencia El lado oscuro de los videojuegos, gestión empresarial. Bueno, Sara Giraldo, ella es CEO de Indie Level Studio y ella ha trabajado en el desarrollo de su carrera profesional en el mundo corporativo durante 8 años. Ella cuenta con esta experiencia